October 19, 1943. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The wind swept across endless cornfields, carrying the smell of dust and diesel fuel from idling trucks beyond the wire. Inside Barracks 7, 5 German prisoners formed a circle around a man named Johannes Kunze, who knelt on the wooden floor trembling. His diary, stolen, read, judged, lay open on a bunk. In it, he'd written that he feared Nazism would destroy Germany. The others had already decided his fate. A rope fashioned from electrical wire dangled from a ceiling beam. Kunze looked up at his fellow soldiers, men he'd fought beside in North Africa, and whispered a question that would never be answered. Then they forced the noose around his neck, kicked away the chair, and watched him die. In that moment, America discovered that bringing the enemy home had brought the war itself to its soil. Before we dive deeper into this chilling story of justice, murder, and wartime secrecy on American ground, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether you're in Munich or Memphis, Sydney, or Stockholm. Your engagement keeps these forgotten histories alive. Share this video with anyone who believes that even the darkest corners of the past deserve light. Now let's return to those barbed wire camps scattered across rural America, where a hidden war was about to explode into violence. The murder went unnoticed for hours. Morning roll call revealed nothing unusual. Kunze was listed as present, his name called, answered by one of his killers. But by afternoon, when guards entered Barracks 7 for a routine inspection, they found him hanging from the beam, his face purple, his body cold. The camp commander was notified immediately. The death was ruled a suicide, case closed. Except it wasn't suicide. And across America, in dozens of other camps, similar scenes were unfolding. The United States had won battles across North Africa and Italy, capturing hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. But it had failed to anticipate what would happen when it imprisoned an army that still believed in Hitler, still enforced Nazi loyalty, still considered traitors worthy of death. The barbed wire kept prisoners in. It did nothing to keep the ideology out. By 1943, the Western Allies faced a problem of unprecedented scale. Where do you put 400,000 enemy soldiers? Britain already held 500,000 German POWs, their camps overflowing. Canada agreed to accept 36,000 more. America initially refused large numbers, fearing mass escapes, sabotage, fifth column activities on home soil. But reality overwhelmed caution. There was simply nowhere else to put them. The United States agreed first to 50,000, then doubled that figure, then doubled it again. By war's end, nearly 400,000 German prisoners would call America home, at least temporarily. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's Office, led by Major General Alan Gullion, scrambled to build a nationwide network of POW camps. They rose almost overnight. Clusters of hastily constructed wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Most were in rural areas: Kansas wheat fields, Oklahoma plains, Texas scrubland, Arizona desert. Remote locations meant fewer escape opportunities and less public scrutiny. The camps were Spartan but functional. They met Geneva Convention standards, and they were staffed by skeleton crews, mostly older soldiers, men deemed unfit for combat duty, and fresh recruits awaiting deployment. The real fighters were overseas. The guards left behind were hardly prepared for what was coming. The first great wave arrived in spring and summer of 1943. These were Afrika Korps veterans, Rommel's men, the elite of Germany's desert warfare machine. They'd fought brilliantly across Libya and Tunisia until Allied air superiority and supply shortages strangled them into submission. On May 13, 1943, over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered at Tunis. It was one of the largest capitulations in military history, and almost overnight, they became America's problem. The logistics were staggering. Trainloads of prisoners moved from Tunis to ports at Oran and Casablanca. There, they were crammed into the holds of cargo ships returning empty from supply runs to North Africa. The journey across the Atlantic took 2 weeks in conditions that were crowded but not cruel. The prisoners arrived at ports in New York, Norfolk, and Newport News. From there, trains carried them inland, sometimes 1,000 miles, sometimes 2,000. The Germans stared out windows at a landscape that defied their propaganda training. No bombed cities, no starving civilians, no signs of a nation struggling under wartime deprivation. Instead, vast farmlands, thriving towns, factories belching smoke from round-the-clock production. Some prisoners insisted the trains were driving in circles to create an illusion of size. But the journey went on for days, and the prosperity never ended. It was their first lesson in why Germany was losing. America wasn't just fighting. It was thriving. The trains themselves shocked the Germans. These weren't cattle cars or freight wagons. They rode in surplus Pullman passenger cars with upholstered seats and regular meals. German soldiers were accustomed to traveling in boxcars with a single bucket for sanitation. One prisoner later wrote that he thought it was a mistake, that surely this luxury was reserved for officers. But it wasn't. The United States was following Geneva Convention protocols to the letter. POWs were entitled to the same food, lodging, and treatment as American troops on the home front. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had made the policy explicit. America would set a global example through its treatment of prisoners, hoping, though not expecting, that Germany would reciprocate with captured Americans. The camps were comfortable. Too comfortable, some Americans complained. Newspapers ran stories calling them the Fritz Ritz. The prisoners ate 3 meals a day, played soccer, watched movies, painted landscapes, staged theatrical productions. They formed orchestras and held concerts. They received mail from home and sent letters back, censored but delivered. To rural Americans struggling with rationing and the absence of their own sons overseas, the sight of German prisoners eating hearty meals and playing sports felt obscene. But Stimson held firm. The treatment wasn't charity. It was strategy. If America demonstrated humanity, perhaps its own boys in German camps would receive the same. What no one anticipated was that the German POWs would become economically indispensable. By 1943, American farms and factories were hemorrhaging workers. Millions of men had enlisted or been drafted. Millions more had migrated to higher-paying defense jobs. Agricultural regions faced crop failures from labor shortages. Enter the prisoners. Under Geneva Convention rules, POWs could be employed for non-military labor at prevailing wages, 80 cents a day, paid into camp accounts. Suddenly, German prisoners were picking cotton in Arkansas, harvesting wheat in Kansas, canning vegetables in Minnesota, cutting timber in Oregon. Politicians and chambers of commerce lobbied for camps the way they lobbied for highways and dams. A POW camp was an economic gift, and the prisoners worked hard. They were grateful for the pay, the activity, the break from barracks monotony. But beneath the surface of this orderly system, something dark was growing. The U.S. Army had failed to screen prisoners during the chaos of mass surrender and transport. Hardcore Nazis, SS officers, party officials, fanatical believers, were mixed indiscriminately with ordinary Wehrmacht conscripts, anti-Nazis, and men who'd lost faith in Hitler. Inside the camps, the zealots quickly established control through a shadow hierarchy invisible to American guards. They held kangaroo courts. They enforced Nazi loyalty. They identified traitors, men who spoke favorably of America, who worked too hard, who expressed doubt about the fatherland's ultimate victory, and they punished them. At first with beatings, social isolation, destruction of personal belongings. But as the war turned against Germany, as news of Allied victories filtered into the camps, the punishments escalated. Men began to die. Johannes Kunz's death at Camp Concordia was not the first, but it was the first to break through the wall of silence. A second prisoner at Concordia, a man named Horst Gunther, was also driven to suicide shortly after. Guards grew suspicious. An investigation was launched. Witnesses were found, men terrified of retribution but more terrified of complicity in murder. 5 prisoners were identified as the ringleaders. They were arrested, isolated, and charged. The U.S. Army realized too late that it had imported not just soldiers but an entire system of terror. The war had come home, and now America would have to decide what justice looked like when the enemy was already behind bars. The murders multiplied. On November 4, 1943, at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, A mob of prisoners beat a man named Hugo Kraus to death with clubs and fists. His crime: allegedly writing a note to American authorities suggesting bombing targets in Germany. The attack happened in broad daylight in the camp compound. Over 200 prisoners witnessed it. None intervened. Kraus died of massive internal injuries, his skull fractured, his ribs shattered. American guards arrived too late. The mob dispersed, melting back into the barracks. No one would name names. The code of silence held. In Texas, another prisoner was beaten to death. In Arizona, 7 U-boat crewmen hanged a fellow submariner named Werner Drexler, who'd been transferred from protective custody into their compound despite warnings. Drexler had cooperated with American interrogators providing technical information about U-boats. His former crewmates considered him a traitor to the Kriegsmarine, to Germany, to everything they'd fought for. They waited until lights out, cornered him in the latrine and strangled him with a noose fashioned from bedsheets. His body was discovered at dawn. The 7 killers showed no remorse. In their minds, they'd carried out a lawful execution. In Arkansas, a prisoner named Hans Geller was beaten to death for working too enthusiastically on a farm labor detail. The Nazis accused him of undermining solidarity, of making other prisoners look lazy by comparison. In South Carolina, a man was strangled over rumors he'd spoken favorably of Roosevelt. Catholic priests in multiple camps were severely beaten for refusing to embrace Nazi ideology or for holding religious services that emphasized Christian morality over Aryan supremacy. Gangs of Nazis and anti-Nazis fought with improvised weapons, boards spiked with nails, razor blades embedded in clubs. The violence was spreading, and the American guards were outnumbered, unprepared, and often oblivious until it was too late. The U.S. Army responded with shock and fury. How had this happened under American supervision? Secretary Stimson demanded answers. The Provost Marshal General's office launched investigations at multiple camps simultaneously. Military police interrogated witnesses, often brutally. In the U-boat case, several prisoners were tortured into confessing, beaten, deprived of sleep, threatened with execution. The confessions were later deemed inadmissible, but by then the damage was done. The military had compromised its own moral authority in pursuit of justice. Still, prosecutors pressed forward. Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski, a brilliant Texas lawyer who would later gain fame as the Watergate special prosecutor, led the legal effort. He assembled cases against 15 German prisoners across multiple camps. All were charged with murder. All would face secret military tribunals. The tribunals were hand-picked panels of U.S. military officers with no legal training. They heard evidence in closed proceedings with no press, no public, no outside scrutiny. The accused had military defense attorneys, but the deck was stacked. The prosecution presented witness testimony, forensic evidence, and, in some cases, coerced confessions. The defense argued that killing traitors was a duty under German military law, not murder. The panels were unmoved. All 15 defendants were convicted. All 15 were sentenced to death by hanging. They would be transferred to the maximum security U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to await execution. Under Geneva Convention rules, the United States was required to notify Germany 3 months before executing any POW. The State Department sent formal notifications through neutral Switzerland, which represented American interests in Germany and German interests in America. The documents listed the charges, verdicts, and sentences. Berlin's response was immediate and furious. Germany demanded full trial transcripts, evidence lists, witness statements. They accused America of conducting show trials, of judicial murder. Secretary Stimson refused. The trials were legitimate. The evidence was overwhelming. The executions would proceed as scheduled. But Germany wasn't finished. They were about to change the equation in a way America hadn't anticipated. The German military and SS, acting on orders from the highest levels, conducted a sweep of POW camps across the Reich. American and British prisoners were identified, not for war crimes or legitimate offenses, but for leverage. On December 29th and 30th, 1944, While the Battle of the Bulge raged in the Ardennes and American forces struggled against a desperate German counteroffensive, 15 American POWs were hauled before secret military tribunals in Germany. The charges were absurd: interfering with Reich operations, insulting the German armed forces, spreading defeatist propaganda. 2 Americans had briefly blocked a German sergeant putting up a propaganda poster. Several had punched guards during arguments but caused no injury. One pilot was sentenced to death for saying he hoped to see the entire German army wiped off the face of the earth. 2 were OSS agents who'd expected the worst when captured. But none had committed murder. None had harmed anyone seriously. They were hostages. On January 9, 1945, a telegram arrived in Washington from Berlin via Swiss intermediaries. Germany proposed a trade: the lives of 5 condemned Americans, listed by name, rank, and hometown, for the lives of the 5 Germans from Camp Tonkawa. The names hit the State Department like a bomb. One was misspelled. Another, Lieutenant James Grayfield of Massachusetts, didn't appear in any military records. Who was he? Was it a mistake? A coded message? The Swiss were asked to investigate. Meanwhile, Secretary Stimson faced an impossible choice. The Germans were offering an unequal trade: 5 Americans guilty of nothing for 5 Germans who'd participated in a brutal mob killing. Every fiber of his being resisted. But State Department officials pressed him. What if the Americans were executed and the public learned the government had refused a chance to save them? The political fallout would be devastating. Stimson agreed to halt the executions and allow negotiations. The killers at Leavenworth received a stay. The game had changed. The negotiations were conducted through Swiss diplomats shuttling between Washington and Berlin. They were marked by confusion, misunderstandings, and hardball tactics. Germany added more Americans to the list, eventually reaching 15, matching the number of Germans on death row at Leavenworth. Berlin claimed that one American, Louis Biagioni, an OSS agent who'd parachuted into Nazi-occupied Italy, was worth 2 Germans. The Americans rejected that calculus but didn't press the point. Both sides pledged to halt all executions during negotiations. The clock was ticking. Germany was collapsing on both fronts. Soviet forces were pushing toward Berlin from the east. American and British armies were crossing the Rhine. Time was running out for the Third Reich, and for the 15 Americans whose lives hung in the balance. The United States proposed a mass exchange at 2 points along the Swiss-German border. At one location, the 15 Germans would be released into German custody. Simultaneously, at another location, the 15 Americans would be handed over to Allied representatives. It was clean, symmetrical, final. Berlin agreed in principle. Dates were proposed, then postponed. Communication became sporadic as Germany's infrastructure disintegrated under Allied bombing. Roads were impassable, phone lines were cut, command structures were collapsing. Swiss diplomats reported increasing difficulty reaching responsible authorities in Berlin. No one knew who was in charge anymore. The negotiations stalled. Then came the breakthrough, not diplomatic but military. As Allied forces overran German territory, they liberated POW camps. Some of the 15 Americans were freed by advancing British units, others by American armored divisions. They emerged from captivity into the chaos of Nazi Germany's final days: cities in ruins, roads clogged with refugees, SS units executing deserters in the streets. The liberated Americans were debriefed, documented, and sent home. By early April, the majority of the 15 were accounted for and safe. The exchange became moot. On April 3, 1945, Swiss diplomats sent a final message. Due to the collapse of communications and governmental authority in Germany, they could no longer facilitate negotiations. The Reich was finished. The war in Europe would end in weeks. And the 15 Germans at Leavenworth were left in limbo, their death sentences suspended indefinitely, their fates uncertain. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, VE Day. Church bells rang across America. Soldiers celebrated in the streets. And in a quiet office at the War Department, Army Provost Marshal General Archer Lurch pulled out a list of 15 names. He began checking them off, confirming that all the condemned Americans were accounted for and safe. 13 were confirmed immediately. One had died of illness during captivity, not executed, just unlucky. The mysterious Lieutenant James Grayfield was never identified or found. Lurch suspected it was a clerical error, a phantom name added by German bureaucrats to inflate the numbers. But he couldn't be certain. With all American hostages safe or accounted for, Lurch faced a new question. What do we do with the Germans? The answer was not simple. The war was over, but the crimes remained. 15 men had been convicted of murder in military tribunals that followed proper procedure, albeit in secret. The convictions were legally sound. The evidence was overwhelming. But the context had changed. Germany was defeated, occupied, divided. The Nazi Party was outlawed. The concentration camps had been liberated, their horrors revealed to a stunned world. Nuremberg trials were being organized to prosecute major war criminals. In this new landscape, did it make sense to hang 15 POWs for crimes committed within their own community, enforcing a loyalty oath to a regime that no longer existed? Secretary Stimson wrestled with the question. So did his successor, Robert Patterson. The decision was kicked to President Truman. Truman reviewed the cases individually. He consulted with military advisors, legal experts, and State Department officials. The facts were clear, but the politics were murky. America was transitioning from wartime ally of the Soviets to Cold War adversary. Germany, or at least the Western zones, would need to be rebuilt as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Executing German POWs for enforcing Nazi discipline might complicate that effort. But refusing to execute them would send a message that murder could be excused if the political winds shifted. It was a test of America's principles. Did justice bend to convenience? Or did it remain consistent even when inconvenient? The debate raged for months. The men on Leavenworth's death row waited, some praying for mercy, others defiant to the end. In the end, the executions proceeded, but not all of them. Some sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. Others were reduced to long terms with the possibility of parole. But the ringleaders, the men who'd organized the killings, who'd enforced terror within the camps, who'd shown no remorse, faced the gallows at Fort Leavenworth. The hangings were carried out quietly, with no press, no publicity, no fanfare. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves. The cases were sealed. For decades, the story remained classified, a footnote buried in War Department archives. America had demonstrated that it would enforce justice even against defeated enemies. But it had also revealed the limits of that justice, the way principles could be bent, never broken entirely, but bent, when geopolitical realities demanded flexibility. The POW camps closed quickly after VE Day. By the end of 1946, almost all German prisoners had been repatriated, sent back to a homeland divided into occupation zones and struggling to rebuild from rubble. The camps were dismantled, the barracks torn down, the land returned to farming or sold to developers. Within a few years, little physical evidence remained that 400,000 enemy soldiers had lived, worked, and sometimes killed on American soil. The story faded from public memory, overshadowed by the larger horrors of the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, and the emerging Cold War, but the legacy lingered in unexpected ways. The United States had attempted something unprecedented, holding a massive enemy population according to international law, while prosecuting crimes within that population through military justice. It had largely succeeded. The vast majority of German POWs were treated humanely, fed well, and returned home safely. Many later spoke positively of their time in America, crediting it with reshaping their understanding of democracy and human rights. But the murders revealed the cost of ideological war, that soldiers carry their beliefs with them into captivity, that barbed wire contains bodies but not ideas, that terror can flourish even under the watchful eyes of guards who believe they're being humane. Lieutenant Colonel Leon Jaworski went on to a distinguished legal career, culminating in his role as Watergate Special Prosecutor. He rarely spoke publicly about the POW cases, but in private correspondence he acknowledged the moral complexity. The Germans had killed traitors according to their own code of honor. America had executed them according to its own code of justice. Both sides believed they were right. History judged them differently. The difference, Jaworski noted, was that American justice allowed for evidence, defense, and appeal, even in secret tribunals. German justice in those camps allowed for none of those things. Just accusation, verdict, and death. The most haunting aspect of the story is its modern resonance. Hostage diplomacy, the practice of detaining foreign nationals on inflated or fabricated charges to use as bargaining chips, has become commonplace. Brittany Griner traded for a Russian arms dealer. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich exchanged for a Russian assassin. Dozens of Americans still held abroad on pretexts designed to create leverage. The Nazis pioneered the tactic in 1944 with those 15 condemned Americans. They demonstrated that even a collapsing regime could force a superpower to negotiate by threatening innocent lives. The lesson was learned, and it's being applied today by regimes from Moscow to Tehran, from Caracas to Pyongyang. The 15 Germans on death row at Leavenworth held up a cracked mirror to 1940s America. The reflection showed a nation trying to uphold principles while fighting an enemy that rejected those principles entirely. It showed the tension between justice and mercy, between consistency and pragmatism, between the letter of the law and the spirit of decency. America wanted to be the righteous victor, the nation that treated prisoners better than any other power in history. And in most cases, it succeeded. But when threatened, when its own soldiers' lives hung in the balance, it bent. Not far, not irreversibly, but enough to reveal that even the most principled nations make compromises when the stakes are survival rather than ideals. Johannes Kunze died in a barracks in Kansas for writing in his diary that he feared Nazism would ruin Germany. He was right. Germany was ruined, its cities destroyed, its people starving, its territory divided. But his killers believed they were defending something sacred: loyalty, honor, the fatherland. They went to their deaths at Leavenworth convinced they'd done their duty. And perhaps that's the most chilling lesson of all, that men can commit murder and call it justice, that they can strangle a fellow soldier and sleep soundly afterward, that ideology can twist conscience so completely that killing becomes not just permissible, but necessary. The barbed wire kept the prisoners in, but it couldn't keep out the poison they'd brought with them. The belief that some lives mattered less than others, that dissent deserved death, that loyalty to a cause justified any crime. America tried to contain that poison, tried to prosecute it, tried to execute it out of existence. But it never quite succeeded. Because the poison wasn't just in 15 men. It was in an idea. And ideas don't die on a gallows. They wait, patient and quiet, for the next crisis. The next war, the next moment when nations decide that principles are luxuries they can't afford. The camps are gone now, the barracks are dust, but the mirror remains, cracked and clouded, reflecting questions we still haven't answered about justice, mercy, and what we're willing to sacrifice when we're afraid.